going to kick off our final session of the day one of this so far fantastic workshop, and it's just going to keep going with an awesome set of speakers here this afternoon. So before I turn it over to them, I'm going to do introductions here and let you know who's going to be talking to you and who you're going to be asking questions of. So we're switching. We were just in the Miami and Phoenix areas talking about extreme heat. We're now going to move east and up the coast towards Baltimore and that part of the world to talk about environmental justice issues there, both urban and rural. And reminder to mute when you join back. Got a lot going on right there. It's all good. So, and to tell us about their work and about the issues there, we have Donzel Brown Jr. Donzel is the executive director and co-founder of the Environmental Justice Journalism Initiative. He has more than 20 years of political, community, and executive experiences working in and with leadership to improve communities of Baltimore and the nation. He's organized, fundraised, and created coalitions to influence growth in multiple sectors, and is also a commissioner for the Mayor's Office of Sustainability. He's experienced working with farms and several nonprofit organizations, and is a graduate of St. Vincent College, and was also recently a top legislative aide to State Senator Mary Washington. So Donzel, thanks for being here. It's good to have you. And Donzel is joined by Rona Covell, IJNR alum, as you just heard, and a co-founder and founding editor of the Environmental Justice Journalism Initiative. Rona spent 9 years at the Baltimore Sun and then 8 at the Chesapeake Bay Journal. She was editor of Chesapeake Quarterly, a magazine that Marilyn Sea Grant produces, as well as a producer for several films about environmental justice. She is an accomplished freelance writer with work appearing in publications like, all right, we're going to need folks to mute here when they join. There we go. She's had articles in the Washington Post, Boston Globe, Grist, Slate, Yale Environment 360, and many others, and graduated in May 2022 with her Master of Arts from University of Maryland's Philip Merrill College of Journalism, where she created and teaches an environmental justice course. And she's also teaching an honors course at UMBC focusing on sounds of environmental justice, and is a graduate of the University of Michigan, back in Dave's stomping grounds, and was a Knight Wallace Fellow there. So that is who we have with us. I'm going to make both of you co-hosts so you can share your screens with whatever you want to show us. And Rona, were you going first or is Donzel going first?
I'm going to go first and then turn it over to my fearless, esteemed executive director.
Sounds like a plan, and go for it. I'll stand down.
I'm going to share my screen here and go from. Can everybody see my screen? Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. Thank you very much. It's really quite an honor to be here speaking to you all. I'm a really huge fan of IJNR and everything they do. And I have been beneficiary of many institutes. Hopefully this will not be the last one where I speak or join. So Donzel and I are kind of splitting our talk into two parts, rural and urban, and I'm the rural one. This is called Eroding History, and it is based on the work I did for my thesis and also a film that we are working on now, and then also just the work I've been doing as a reporter on the Eastern Shore for quite some time. And the road that we're featuring here is called Riley Roberts. And what I kind of decided to do was, instead of looking at climate change and environmental justice on the Eastern Shore writ large, I thought, well, what if I could break it down to one community? And then I thought, what if I could break it down to one street in the community? So that's what I did. And that's me standing in the road when it flooded last November. And just to sort of, I'm sure you probably have learned this already, but the environmental justice movement really began in North Carolina when protesters began to fight a toxic waste landfill in Afton. And I actually just got back from North Carolina yesterday. I was touring the first Black incorporated town in the United States, which is called Princeville. And North Carolina, like every other state, continues to fight environmental justice issues. And when we think about environmental justice, we typically think about scenes like this, which this is right by where I used to live. This is the Baltimore incinerator, and they've been trying to shut it down for a long time. It is very polluting in South Baltimore. It's creating all kinds of issues, respiratory problems. And Donzel will talk a little bit about some of the issues as to why it just sort of keeps on going and they can't get it shut down. So these are a lot of the issues that you are probably aware of in environmental justice in urban areas. And, lack of access to power, fewer green spaces, less resilience, lower life expectancies. I have to admit somebody, I think.
I'll do the admitting. Right.
Okay, there are very few Black reporters covering environmental beat in the nation, and almost none in the Chesapeake Bay watershed. Donzel and I are working really hard to change that, but as of now, I do not know of any. And so when you don't have people from different communities covering these stories, a lot of times these stories don't get covered. And one of the things that I try to bring to light with the work that I'm doing is something that I have called rural redlining. Now, my advisors kind of chafed at that because Baltimore is where redlining really began. It was codified into law in Baltimore, and then cities like Chicago and Detroit took what we did and expanded it. Not that this is something we're proud of, but it is where it began. And so what my editors or my advisors said to me, well, what you're talking about isn't really redlining because it wasn't systemic and it wasn't on purpose, but in fact really is. So this is a system by which we are losing our historic treasures. We're losing graveyards and churches. And, what are the elements that make that so? Well, Black communities got the lowest land to begin with, and then they weren't allowed to incorporate. And so not being allowed to incorporate means you really don't have control over your destiny. And then when groups like FEMA and NOAA come in and they volunteer to raise homes and lift things, your home has to be worth a certain amount of value in order for them to lift it. So often you don't get that benefit. And then the state of Maryland, at least, has a pretty robust land preservation program. So you think, okay, well, maybe these homes that can't be developed anymore could be preserved with land preservation money. But according to the state statute, you can't preserve land that's flooded. So they're out of luck there too. And so there's all these systems that are in place that weren't necessarily created to discriminate against people, but that is inevitably what happens. And so I decided to look, like, this is a map from 1870 of the area that I wanted to look at. It's called Dames Quarter. And you can see, it's closest to the water. This was the Black community of Deal Island. And the names on the map, which you can't see that well because we're on Zoom, these are the names of the people who these were their homes. And so the names on this map are Jones, Roberts, there's a Kelly. So they're very common names, lots of Joneses. In fact, Emma Brodus Jones lived on Deal Island, and you might not know that name, but you would know the name of her son, James Baldwin. So he did not grow up on the island, but his mother did, and left when she was 19. So in order to figure out who were the people who lived here, I had to be somewhat creative. And again, this is just the systematic, catastrophic, and deliberative nature of what we're dealing with in rural areas. So, and this is an old school that we snuck into and took some pictures of. I'll talk more about that in a minute. So in order to find people, because there weren't any people who were living here who had grown up there. They were all gone and the homes were all abandoned. But I went to the graveyard, and among all the Joneses, I found this name, Nolden Superior Wigfall. And I kind of figured there's probably only one of him because it's a pretty unique name. And I saw that he served in World War I. So I figured there was probably an obit for him. So I went to the archives and I found the obit. And in the obit, there were the names of his other family members. So then I went to the census records and I found I found him, I found his parents, I found his siblings, and then I found the other Wigfalls. And through this, I was able to kind of construct a family tree of the three main families that settled in this area. And they were the Wallaces, the Wigfalls, and the Joneses. And they tended to intermarry. And so they all knew each other. And so this really got me started. This person was also extremely helpful. His name is Ducky, and he calls himself the junk man of Deal Island. And you talk to him for a while and you realize that he's brilliant and he remembers everything. He's a Wallace. And so he pointed me in the direction of Wigfalls because he married into the Wigfall family, which I found a lot of people did. This is Mr. John Jones and Marlene Wallace Wigfall. Just like to show people so they can see that there are people here and that there was the community here. These are the Shores girls. Both of their parents were named Shores. They swear their parents were not related to each other because they're from different towns 5 miles away. But so and their store was called Shores and Shores. And they told me stories about, everybody coming to the gas station where they had and pumping out molasses on payday, and everyone taking care of each other, and just nothing but love in the town. This is Chauncey Wallace, who told me about there was a club on this island. It was a black resort that Lorraine Wigfall Henry opened, and it was called Henry's Beach. And when Chauncey was 6 years old, he used to run through the field and sneak over to the concert hall to hear James Brown and Percy Sledge. They all played there. And there was a baseball field that's still there. And that's where the Negro Leagues practiced when they were traveling, since they couldn't play other places. That's the pastor. He's a lot of fun. And he comes every week to preach at the church on Riley Roberts Road. And he drives 45 minutes each way. He's paid maybe $10,000 a year for his work. So it's definitely a labor of love. This is just kind of what it looks like on the island. It's really gorgeous. And this is Riley Roberts Road, which is not as gorgeous. And you can see this is Phragmites on either side of the road. On either side of this road, there were homes, and now they're all gone. And in some cases, there's wreckage, and in some cases, there's just nothing. This is the church. This is the back of the church. It floods all the time, this church, and they have had a really hard time getting any money from historic preservation to preserve what they have, even though many other wealthy white communities have gotten such funds. These are the graves that come up in the floods. It's very sad to see. They come up when it rains too much because of the water table, and they have to pay to have them reburied. These are other places in similar situations. There's another church on Deal Island that is also in very bad disrepair, you can see. And so, this is a Rosenwald school. I don't know if you're familiar with Rosenwald schools, but Julius Rosenwald and Booker T. Washington made a partnership in the 1900s to build schools for Black children, and because the states neglected to provide education. And now these schools are kind of considered treasures, and there's a lot of effort going into restoring them. This school is so forgotten that it wasn't even on the list of Maryland Rosenwald schools. It was like among the forgotten of the forgotten. until somebody drove by and realized what it was, because they look architecturally, the Rosenwald schools have like a formula where they have basically 2 large classrooms, big windows, big whiteboards, and then in the back they have a kitchen. So they all kind of have a similar look, and so you can kind of tell when you see one. And that's more of the inside. Someone just abandoned it. You can see the outside. And so I've had people say to me like, well, how do you know, how can you really say that, any of this is racist? Like that, Black communities were really discriminated against because they didn't have X, Y, and Z. Aren't you putting a whole bunch of things together that don't really necessarily fit? And so I thought about it, and then I thought, well, what if there was a community that started out with higher ground to begin with? They were able to get incorporated. They were able to put in their own zoning. They had the technical expertise in the community to get grants for things like rain gardens and beach stabilization. They could put in their own rules about what to do when a property falls into disrepair, as opposed to just letting it be abandoned. And they had pull in the state legislature if they needed additional funds for this and that. Well, there is such a community in Baltimore and in Maryland, and this is it. It's called Highland Beach, and it was incorporated in the 1920s. It was founded by Frederick Douglass's son. If you look at this picture, the turquoise house was Paul Laurence Dunbar, the poets. The middle one is Mary Church Terrell, and the last one, the one that's yellow with brown trim, that was Frederick Douglass's summer home. He never did get to live there, but he got to see it. And from across the bay, you could see the eastern shore where he had been enslaved. And so this place they've done marketing. They have like a very uniform street sign that honors Frederick Douglass. They have a museum honoring their past. Some of these pictures are from that. And then the mayor, he's recently retired, but Bill Sanders was the mayor. He's a PhD in environmental science, and he ran the Environmental Justice Division of the EPA. So he was a man who knew how to find funding to do things that he wanted to do. And his wife worked at the Audubon Society. So she had a similar background to him. And so they had the ability and the technical expertise to get funding to improve their community. There are only 2 incorporated communities in the county where this town is. The other one is Annapolis. So Annapolis has about 50,000 people. Highland Beach has about 400, and they got incorporated because of who Frederick Douglass Jr. was. And so I wanted to sort of show that, if you give a community all of the tools that so many white communities have, that they will also thrive, and that it is in fact environmental injustice and environmental discrimination to not allow communities to have things like their own zoning, like their own ability to incorporate, their own ability to get funds, these restrictions about rebuilding in floodplains. Those things, the net effect of it is that they are discriminatory. And I'm going to stop sharing I think I have a couple more slides. Hold on. This is just the view at Highland Beach. It's a very beautiful view, and you can see like across the water, that's Talbot County, where Frederick Douglass was enslaved. And one thing that Highland Beach has had to contend with is the white communities around it want this beach, and they can't have it because it's private, and it's creating some friction. And that is the end of the presentation. I kept it to 20 minutes.
You did pretty good, Rona. I'm impressed.
Thank you. And I'm going to turn it over to Donzel, who's going to talk about our organization and, why we're doing what we're doing, and a little bit about what he does on the urban. Oh, we both do, but what he's been doing for a lot longer than I have on the urban side.
Thank you, Rona, and thank you everyone for having us. I want to commend Rona on the great work that she's doing out at Dames Quarter in the island, and I encourage everyone to follow along as she's working on producing a movie that we should have released early next year. So we're really excited about that. So EDGI, or the Environmental Justice Journalism Initiative, was founded by a cohort of friends who, for almost a decade now, have been really close. And it's a group of friends. We raised our children together, and it's a diverse group of friends. Some scientists, some journalists, some politicians, architects, artists, everything. Um, and we kind of looked around the table one day at dinner, and we were complaining about a lot of things and how the world was crumbling and all that type of stuff, and just looked around the tables. So, well, if we build, everyone at this table has capacity to affect change, and so how are we going to do that? Two of the most glaring areas in which we saw racial disparities was in the environmental science community, and then the lack of diversity in the stories that are told about environmental science here in Baltimore and Maryland. Oyster farming and fisheries, and they tend to be the focus. The Chesapeake Bay tends to be the focus of environmental justice stories, and rightfully so. However, the communities, especially Black and Brown communities here in Baltimore City, their environmental justice stories were not being told. So something that's common here are sewage backups after rainstorms. Um, there's extreme lack of diversity um, in looking at heat maps, where one community can have a canopy cover which decreases their street temperatures by as much as 20 degrees in less than a mile. So these are things that we are focused on telling the stories about, and that's where our motto comes. If I was going to put up our webpage, if you want to share our webpage, um, is our motto is our community, our story. So um, we have a vision that not going, we're going to allow the people of their communities to tell their environmental justice story and aid them in doing that. Whether it's community leaders or young people, which we tend to work with a lot of young people, is giving them the encouragement and skills to tell their own stories and what they see. Um, and beyond telling their stories, um, I work very much in empowerment of these communities and their young people, and explaining and or helping them learn how to affect change through advocacy, through communications, or whatever it may be. And so Rhoda's theme was rural redlining, and I'll use a case example of what we do with our Highway to Nowhere film called Disruption, that we did last year. And you can find it on our website if you get a chance. It's about a 9-minute film. It's interesting about urban redlining. Um, and so Rhoda mentioned that, Baltimore likes to say we're the city of first. Well, we were the city of first when it comes to redlining. And Robert Moses, pretty much the racist uh, uh, inventor of redlining, started his pilot program here in Baltimore. So we have a highway called the Highway to Nowhere, and we did a film, which we talked to community members and talked to their stories, much like Rona did, about what that community was like before they destroyed and uprooted a community called Poppleton, which they ran a highway straight through the heart of it. Poppleton was a very affluent, during segregation, very affluent Black community, one of the greatest on the East Coast, and they just erased it. And you can learn more from film. Point I bring that up is with urban redlining is not so much um, things like incorporation that are the issue. It's more about um, about politics a lot more, like a lot more stakeholders are involved in decisions like this, and a lot more stakeholders um, have influence on various parts of that decision making process. So um, when we teach here in Baltimore City, the first lesson we do, especially with our young people, is find out everyone who represents you and who's making your decisions for you, from your city council member, from your community president, all the way up, who's making the decisions for you and why. And it leads to getting better answers when you are walking in your community and you're upset about the blight, or your water in your school is not drinkable, or um, there's lead paint in your homes, whatever it might be. So um, we kind of should kind of put it in a nutshell. Although Rona is doing great professional journalism work, we have other people doing great journalism work, and we're not a news source, and we're more of a think tank in the sense that we are kind of, I guess, democratizing the system a little bit when it comes to journalism and storytelling and the storytelling process. Um, Along the another important thing that I would say, and Rona is amazing. The rest of our cohort is amazing. I would say in our intellectual cohort, we probably have 20, 25 people constantly giving us advice, and input is is making sure we're dedicated to mentoring younger people. So on the film that Rona's doing, she was lucky to have a couple PA assistants come out from Baltimore City all the way out to the island to help. Um, we always want to create that mentorship aspect, because when we work with our environmental science branch, which we partner with minorities in aquaculture, uh, and these two fantastic young Black women started this organization because they are in environmental science. One's a shark scientist, one's an aquaculturist, and they were tired of walking into rooms and being the only one that looks like them. So we strongly have like professional mentoring obligations for all of us who are involved um, in edgy, and that includes myself and all the way down. Um, so I'm here to answer any questions if you would like. I don't really have a slide presentation, but I would encourage you to watch the movie because I didn't want to play it and go over time.
Yeah, so thank you so much, Donzel. And folks, you all have the link to the movie in our Slack channel for this workshop. So hopefully some of you were able to watch it beforehand. And if not, it's parked there in the resources channel. And now you know the drill. It is time for questions. And I will happily take them as they come in on the chat list. And thanks again, Donzel and Rona, for meeting with us today. Don't all go at once. Claire is up.
Hey, Rona, thank you so much for presenting, and Denzel. Really, some of the same problems the Eastern Shore has is what we have here down in South Carolina, Black communities that live in very low areas. And my question to you is, how difficult was it for you to do some of the archival research that you did and looking at the census data and all that stuff?
We're really fortunate on the Eastern Shore to have a couple historical centers. And there's one in particular at Salisbury University called the NAB Center, NABB. And I just got super lucky that the main archivist from the NAB Center is from Deal Island. His name is on that map that I showed you. His name is Horner, and he lives on Horner Road with his family. Unfortunately, he didn't know a lot about the Black community. And so he was kind of learning along with me. I mean, he knew everything there was to know about the white community of Deal Island, but he didn't even know that James Baldwin's mom was from there. So he really didn't know much. And but he was able to point me into a lot of resources. It took a lot of time because archival research isn't my strong suit. But I got better at it. And one of the other things that helped me is when I was working on my thesis last year, I went to Deal Island for a month, and just took a month off of my job, and went there and got a house there. And so I was able to like go to the center multiple times. But it is tricky. And the best thing you can do if you're going to do it is kind of find somebody to guide you through it, a librarian or an archivist who knows where all the things are. And once they guide you to the resources that you need, then you can kind of be off and running.
One more question. Obviously, like sea level rise is huge area, is a huge issue for coastal communities, but there's other climate impacts that are erasing history of some of these underserved communities, like mold from increased amount of rain. Acid rain is affecting some of the petroglyphs of the indigenous communities here. Did you look into like any of the other climate impacts, or just the scope of your project was just that?
I basically looked at sea level rise, land subsidence, and groundwater withdrawals, as the issues, sinking land, rising water. And also another important factor in environmental justice is not so much the external factors, but the internal ones, namely neglect. So, you have churches that are deteriorating, and you have a state agency, the Maryland Historic Trust, that is charged with protecting history. So what history do you choose? And if you make a community wait for aid, as it waits, the church or the structure deteriorates to the point where it may not be worth saving if you wait too long. And so to me, those are environmental justice issues also, not just the elements. And I probably should have looked into mold, but I didn't really, because once the churches on the Eastern Shore, the Methodist churches at least, are all very similar. They're like a white clapboard kind of material. And once the water and the salt gets into them, they just sort of deteriorate really quickly. So it's not an issue so much of, let's get in and clean it up. And I mean, the structure just sort of like, falls into itself. So even if you could like clean up the mold and, get it fixed up, I think, once you've got that water in that wood, it's really hard to fix.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Rona. So Jordan had a question.
I'm just curious, and this question's for both of y'all, about what your experiences have been like with fundraising, specifically around projects that are about allowing people to tell their own stories. Because just personally, I've had a hard time if I pitch anything that is like, we're going to train community members and they're going to tell their own stories. Hasn't gone down well.
I guess I'll take that one. It has been a challenge. I think we've been very lucky. So I can't say that we have not been lucky. We started about 20 months ago with a very small idea, and we've grown a lot. But the challenge with our fundraising is we're very easy for us to raise funds to pitch a story. So a lot of our, like Rona's project, Dame's Quarter project, these are project-based funding. Where our challenge with fundraising has been is capacity-based fundraising. So, paying our staff, growing our staff, getting more professionals, raising funds for that's a lot more difficult, because we come in as a upstart and we can go to organization or foundation like we need $50,000 just to pay people. And they're like, well, pay them to do what? Like a lot of stuff. Like sometimes it's making coffee runs, or paying people to do stuff. And that's a hard that's a harder way to fundraise. But if we come up with a project, I find it's pretty easy for us to raise money project based. Can you tell me a little bit more about what you're doing? Because it sounds like you're doing something similar. And where do you live?
Yeah, for sure. So I live in Queens. I live in New York City. And in 2018, I started a women-led audio collective with the whole idea of training community members in audio production and journalism in the form of a local news podcast. And we've run into similar obstacles too, where people are like, we will give you money for a particular project. So if you want to do something on like women in the workplace and you want to have community members go and report on that, great. But operationally, we're not going to give you any money because again, they're like, pick a lane. Either you're a journalism outlet or you're a training production house of sorts. And so that's been difficult to have these conversations where it's like they can be both.
Yeah, I think we definitely have that hurdle as well. I think honestly, the diversity of our mission makes it a little bit easier because we can go to education, people and youth programming here, we go to environmental science here, and we go to journalists like with you guys. And so they all kind of cross over, but we keep them pretty independent. So we're not asking this group of funders, like who do youth programming, to fund aquaculture projects. So we kind of compartmentalize that way, in a sense. But sometimes they overlap, and if you get relationships with a fundraiser, uh, Ronan and I just worked through a grant today, who was one of our our first grantees. Um, but we now have developed a relationship with him, so it
Mhm.
then becomes like a little bit easier. They kind of understand us a little bit more. Um, but very much good luck, and please reach
Yeah.
out to me
I will,
because
yeah.
please reach out to me afterwards because I want to talk to you about your project because something just also came up today with Waterloop, and we could talk to
Yeah,
you about
That would be great.
I want to add something to what Donzella said, and yes, please do follow up because we're talking about podcasting and we've got a couple options on the table. But I personally think if you're going to journalism, journalism organizations for fundraising, I think that's hard because I personally think that a lot of these organizations are kind of snobby and they like to give money to the people that they've given money to before who they know will succeed. So they like to give money to ProPublica. They like to give money to the New York Times. And no, those are wonderful organizations. I don't know that they need the money, but they're wonderful organizations and they're going to put something out that's going to succeed. And so, I mean, Donzel and I really haven't gone after any journalism funding, in part because I know they're going to ask me questions about, well, are you really journalists, and, because, we have a point of view. We're not pretending we don't. We're in favor of righting environmental injustices. And so, is the Knight Foundation going to give us money? I don't think so. Maybe we should ask them. But like, I would suggest to you, like, think about the kinds of shows that you've done and what you want to do, and like if you want to do focus on labor, look to foundations that fund labor. If you want to do shows on women's health care, look at like Guttmacher and stuff like that. And maybe if you pivot away from journalism, you'll have better luck and there will be less of this stay in your lane, because other funders don't really care about your lane. Like, they think it's really cool that we're doing journalism and aquaculture and marine science. From our other funders, we really haven't heard like, well, that's not really journalism, or, like they're just happy to fund the work we're doing. So I think you might have better luck if you try that. Would you
All right,
agree,
I'm gonna ask
Denzel?
you- I-
Yeah,
um,
so we could go into the. Yeah, I see there's a lot of questions. I'll make sure we get to all of them.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is well, you're striking a nerve with Dave, I know.
Yeah.
It is hard to get that journalism money, and so we are very much specific workshop or institute funding. That's where we get most of our money. So but now we are going to move on from funding journalism discussion and let Melissa ask a question, unless it's also a funding journalism discussion, so.
No, I would just like to find out, what do you think, or what do you think contributes to the lack of diversity in environmental reporting? And how do you think that you can get wider participation or get, I noted at the start of your presentation that you said that there were no journalists of color reporting on the issue that you looked at. So how do you think you can get more people of color to participate, or more journalists of color to report on these issues?
I can take that. I think one reason why is the way we've defined environmental journalism. You know, we define environmental journalism as, in the Chesapeake Bay, we define it as, you know, oysters, crabs, open space, fishing, you know, hiking, kayaking, clean water, frogs, turtles, you know, and I'm not saying that these are white things, but they're certainly not inclusive things, because if you can't get to the water, you know, none of those things really apply to you except the clean water. And so I think environmental reporting is about zoning. I think it's about redlining. I think it's about highways. I think it's about transportation. I think it's about where do we put the bike lanes. And I think if we broaden the scope of what we consider to be environment reporting, then we already are more diverse than we think we are. Our friend Sean Yost, he's one of our partners, and he was working at the Afro-American paper here. It was about 2 years ago, and I said, Sean, you know, come join our group. You know, I want you to work with us. And he said, but I'm not an environmental journalist, Rona. And I was like, yes, you are. And he was like, he came back to me and he was like, you know, you're right, I am one. And it's because he, you know, he's been covering environmental stories in Baltimore on lead and, you know, equity and, you know, mold and housing projects and all this kind of stuff. But he didn't think of himself as an environment journalist because no one ever called him one. And if he had gone to the Baltimore Sun to get a job as an environmental journalist, they never would have hired him, because they would have said, you don't cover the environment. So I think we have to redefine what we consider to be environmental journalism. And I think that's, I don't want to talk too much. I know we have more questions.
Yeah, I would
yeah.
make it the shortest answer possible in saying, you asked what could be done to change that. That's what we're doing. So that's really what we're trying to do every day. So this is our idea for trying to do that.
Thanks, you too. And we're firm believers at IJNR too, that, I mean, basically any reporter is an environment reporter, because you can find an environment angle to just about any health, business, economic story, whatever it is. All right, Christine, you're up next.
Okay, thank you for your initiative. Sounds excellent. Thank you for sharing with us about it. And this is a question for Rona. If you could talk to us a little bit, I'm wondering about. It sounds fascinating, the reporting you did, and I really appreciated hearing like how. But it sounded very time consuming. So my question is, how much time did it take? And did you find that reporting this way for the initiative? I mean, how did that change? How was that different than, I mean, was this project different than a straight up journalism story you would have done in the past? Did you have more time, or was it different in any way? And also, in terms of the data available, did you also look into, and did you find that there were ways to, those people who questioned you about the validity of what you were saying? You gave a very good explanation, a very convincing and strong explanation about why you believe it is true. But did you also, is there data available that you can also, studies that have been done similar to the redlining research that shows redlining and heat islands go hand in hand? Is there any data available, and could you point us toward anything that might be worthwhile looking into on any range of stories?
Yeah, I could anyone who wants, if you give me your email, I can give you a link to my thesis, which is in Google Drive, and you can look at the bibliography, the sources. I'm trying to remember off the top of my head. I did have to, what I found was that something that we take for granted, that we know, that if I told just a random person, Black people got the lowest land to begin with, and that started a cascade of discrimination in rural areas, most people would be like, yeah, that makes sense. Like, I believe you, that tracks. But scientists where I worked at University of Maryland were like, prove it. And I was like, how do you prove something that's common knowledge? And they were like, you have to prove it. You need data. And so prior to writing my thesis, I wrote an article for the magazine that I was editor for, where I really did like try to go back and prove this. And I found a few things. One is a study that was done by two geographers, and it was about racialized topographies, and they proved a correlation between low land and Black residents. And then there were a lot of studies that were done out of University of Maryland, Baltimore Law School on redlining, and I extrapolated some of that stuff to the rural areas. And then there was another study recently done here about wetlands preservation and how Black communities got very little of that money. So, I mean, I had to like take pieces from here and there to kind of like put together this narrative. It was much more challenging than I thought it would be. Because I figured, oh, somebody's done this before, I can't be the first to look into it. So that was hard. And in terms of time, I have to say I really enjoyed, I'm going from like, I started my career as like a really fast deadline reporter covering police. And then I moved to a weekly, and then a monthly, and then a quarterly. And then with my thesis, I really just took my time, and it was the best way of reporting. I would ride my bicycle somewhere with a notebook, and I would run into someone, and I would just like talk to them and take some notes. And then I would go back and look up some of the stuff they said. And because with a thesis, you don't need like that same precision that you do with a news article that's getting printed. And so I found I could sort of like go into different directions, and I really enjoyed it. So I know that is like a super luxurious thing that you get to do, take a month off your job and research and write something. And I am very grateful that I was able to finagle that.
Thanks,
Thank
Rona.
you.
OSHA.
Rona, can you post a link to that study? Sorry to interrupt, but you mentioned that first one of the geographers that looked at low-lying land.
Just a second.
Thanks so much.
So I looked up Dames Quarter, and I assumed that it was still a predominantly Black community. I might have gotten the wrong Dames Quarter, but it looks like it from the map that it's the same. And it said that it's 84% white. Does that track with what you know? Is that wrong? And if it tracks with what you know, I assume there's a story there about what happened to the Black community of the Klan or whatever coming in and terrorizing them and moving out. But do you know, does that sound right to you?
Yes, it sounds right, but no, not to the Klan part. So what happened was Dames Quarter had a Black community. It's not a very large community to begin with, but Riley Roberts Road was the Black community. And over time, what happened was those houses fell. The job community on the Eastern Shore changed drastically in the 60s. There were a lot of jobs at canning companies, seafood companies. And when those jobs disappeared, the work was basically in Salisbury and in Baltimore. And so people moved, their children left Dames Quarter, and they went to Salisbury, Princess Anne, Baltimore, Philadelphia, and they basically cleared out. And when that happened, instead of selling their homes, a lot of times the home deteriorated. It wasn't worth fixing. And what happened a lot on Riley Roberts Road is that the homes just basically disintegrated. And so what happened then was all you had was the land. A lot of times the families didn't keep up the payments on the land. The land would go to tax sale. Somebody would buy the property, put a trailer on for duck hunting or whatever, and then hope that the state would buy the land because it's wet and they don't want it to develop. Realize the state wouldn't buy the land, and then in 3 years the cycle began again, and the people who bought the they didn't pay their taxes, and then it went up again. So not only is it basically abandoned, the Black neighborhood has 2 Black people currently living there. One is Marlene Wallace Wigfall, who's in her 80s. Her home is currently flooded, but she's still living in it. And then the other one is this guy named Leonard, who he lost his family home, but he was able to buy another parcel and he put a trailer on it, and that's where he lives. So the rest of the road is largely abandoned because you can't really live there because the road is so wet. The other side of Dames Corridor, where the white community lives, is absolutely stunning. You have beautiful houses, water views. It's like, that's where the $500,000 houses are. So yeah, I mean, I think that's one example of the just looking at Wikipedia or the census data, it doesn't tell you everything. There's much more there to that story.
Thanks, Rana. Spurthy, you had a question.
Yeah, hi. Just kind of tagging along with the same narrative. You're talking about migration and people who move because of jobs, and things change economically, and then people are forced to move. But there's also this angle of climate migration where people are forced to move because of the changing climate increasingly. So when you look at these stories of history erased and these census data right now being skewed because people have left places and all that, what does it tell you as a researcher who has looked into this in terms of what the future holds for these communities which are already marginalized?
I think there's tough decisions ahead. Like I said, I was just in North Carolina in this town called Princeville. In 1999, after Hurricane Floyd, Princeville was basically destroyed. It was all underwater, and the Department of Environmental Quality wanted to move everybody to higher ground. And the people in Princeville voted resoundingly not to do that, in part because they were afraid. They didn't trust the government that they wouldn't lose their property. And so they stayed. And whether that was the right thing to do or not the right thing to do, they are there. And they are working on building a resilient community now. And they're planting rain gardens, and they've bought property for a commercial core. And they're, they've basically decided that they're not going to wait for the Army Corps of Engineers to fix the levee. They're going to control what they can control. And they have a fantastic leadership team of extremely accomplished people, and they're getting it done. And I think they're going to be fine. I think they're going to build a really robust, resilient community, despite being 40 feet below the white community across the river. And I think they're going to be just fine. I don't have that same confidence in Dames Corridor, in part because they're not incorporated. They can't make their own decisions. They don't have any elected officials anywhere near where they live. They're 19 miles from the county seats. They've been forgotten. I mean, even something as simple as getting the ditches cleaned so that the road doesn't flood, they're last on the list. And so I think the best they can hope for is to maybe save their cultural touchstones, like the churches. But in terms of it ever being a place where people can live again, at least on the Black community side, I don't see that happening, unfortunately.
Thanks, Rona.
Gonzal, did you have anything to add, or I can move on to
Oh, you can certainly move on. Rona is certainly the expert at James Quarter. I've been there several times, and it's absolutely beautiful, and it's absolutely astonishing how much climate change has just wiped out an entire community. But the people are amazing. I've had a lot of fun there. But I'll leave that subject up to her.
All right. Melissa had another question.
Do you think that sometimes environmental reporting, that there's a disconnect between the natural reporting on the natural environment and the social environment? Because for us here in the Caribbean, things that happen in North America can easily affect, as you all were speaking on a demonstration in terms of migratory patterns, can easily affect the movement of people between our region, North America, etc. So do you think that there is that disconnect when we report as journalists, that sometimes that full picture that takes into view both the natural and social environment, that there's a disconnect in our reporting as journalists?
I know for me, like on a community level, and the stories that people tell me and that people I interact with, I definitely think 100% there's a disconnect. And I think that's why we have this component of well, our motto is our community, our story, because here Baltimore is a very segregated city, with a lot of migrants of all types, but they tend to self-segregate, even amongst racial lines. A black person from East Baltimore does not have the same cultural experiences a black person from West Baltimore, and some of those are economic changes, some of those are um, environmental changes, where people move around and migrate and don't tend to try to understand one another, where they are, and how to engage, particularly with media on what, because and there's certainly a distrust of media as well, and in our underserved communities. So there's not much of a, I mean, certain parts of West Baltimore, I say there's not much of a difference between a trust between a reporter and a cop. Um, and telling your story, to a media outlet, a newspaper or something like that, is something that a lot of people don't feel comfortable doing. They just don't want to do it. So there's definitely, that's a definite hurdle with engaging people uh, in any manner.
Rona, did you have any thoughts on that?
I really agree with what Donzel said, and I would just say that like I said before, I think there is a disconnect because we have allowed ourselves to become disconnected. When I was a Baltimore Sun reporter, a Chesapeake Bay reporter, I rarely did stories in the city, and in fact, whenever I did, my editors would come over and say, we're really sorry, but we need you to go to West Baltimore and write about this parking lot. And I'd be like, cool, and they'd be like, yeah, we know it's not really your beat, but I never minded doing those stories. I like doing different things, and I like doing interesting things, and I like that it's a quicker drive than going all the way to the Eastern Shore. But I just think that we've allowed ourselves to kind of define the environment beat in a way that excludes a lot of people. And Donzel and I, through our organization, are really trying to reverse that.
Awesome. Thank both of you. Does anybody else have a question? I don't have any waiting in the queue here, but we definitely have time if you want to explore this more. And whenever you don't have one in the queue, I'm going to ask one. But I did want to ask you, Rona and Donzel, a lot of what we try to do is kind of take national trends or stories and get them down to a community level. And just from what you're doing in Baltimore, there's been a lot made over the Biden administration finally saying things like environmental justice out loud and starting these initiatives to try to correct some historic injustices. And I'm just curious, do you see anything playing out yet at a state or city or like at a governmental level that shows, oh yeah, this stuff is doing work, or is it more just good optics? And
I
lots
can
of
give you a very forceful answer on this, and no.
okay.
So there's a couple elements that are happening right now. Yes, the spotlight is being shown on environmental justice. Everyone, not everyone, but everyone, is aware of it, and there's a lot of lip service that I've had. The here at Maryland, last year they failed to pass a constitutional amendment for environmental justice. They'll do it again this year. It'll probably fail again this year. The Biden administration has released funds to the city of Baltimore. However, there is a lot of stipulations and hoops for you have access to those federal funds through the city, which then prices out community-led organizations like ourselves from applying for those grants. And so what will happen in Baltimore, we've seen it with federal funds all the time. They'll open up this portal to federal funds for a certain initiative or where it might be, and it all goes to about I would say 4 or 5 different large organizations for them to handle. Primarily here in Baltimore City, we go to Johns Hopkins University. So the federal government will give the money to Baltimore, create a whole list of stipulations for access to the funds, and what the city will do is end up just being lazy about it, to be honest, and just giving it to Johns Hopkins to administer the federal funding. And if to give you a scope of the landscape, Johns Hopkins is not a community-oriented research facility and hospital. They're at odds with the community at most times. So they give more of that federal money to organizations, some of the larger nonprofits, to deal with it. And it just doesn't end up trickling down to the community. So I have very low confidence in that federal funding even making a difference in the communities here. I'm making a hard push for it, but if you watch the movie Disruption, is another example. Federal funds, highway funds, were given to the city of Baltimore to fix the eyesore that is the highway to nowhere, and rectify the injustice in its ongoing political situation where there's very little I would say productive community support for their input on what should happen with that stretch of land. So why I believe what we're doing is so important is that we are informing the communities, we're giving the communities a voice, we're informing them about who's making decisions and why and what happened, and we're going out to the community and asking their leaders and their community members like what the future will bring. But as a city, Baltimore is very bad at handling federal funding. For that reason, it's a ongoing playing saga that happens here.
If I can add something to that, I agree with everything Donzel said. Yesterday, I was on a panel for the North Carolina Department of Environmental Quality, and Louis Rivers, who some of you might know, he's a research scientist at EPA in North Carolina. He was on the panel too, and somebody asked a question about funding and how we can all operate in this scarcity of funds, and he said there is not a scarcity of funds. North Carolina is an extremely wealthy state. The United States is an extremely wealthy country. There is money to do everything we need to do and want to do. It's a question of how the money is allocated. And like Donzel said, if Baltimore City gets a couple $1 billion and gives it to Johns Hopkins to distribute, you know, uh, our organization's probably
I'll
not.
give I'll give us example. So we have a very small grant in which I won't name those. We're working with a very large organization on this grant, and um, and they had 3 grant administrators, full-time paid grant administrators, to administer our grant. We don't have 3 time full-time people to handle, $10,000 that you want to give us, but they have 3 full-time people working on it. And won't fund us for, as I mentioned before when Jordan spoke, won't fund us for capacity building, but for a project when they can take, a photo op and
Mhm.
like, look, we help the kids.
And I think we have to be really mindful of that as a Black-led organization. So, Donzel's our executive director, and we have it's 2 amazing women Black scientists, Simone and Imani, working with us, and Sean Yost, who's another he's a Black journalist. So I'm actually, the lone white lady in the group, which is fine. I like that. I'm just fine with that. But we have to be really careful that groups want to give us like a very small amount of money, so they can take a picture with us and they can add it to their DEI list of accomplishments. And we've encountered that, and we want real environmental justice work to happen, whether we do it or someone else does it. So we're really not interested in that kind of thing, and we can kind of sniff it out from a mile away, so to speak, when we see it. And I want to be protective of my partners. So when I encounter and I get kind of um, annoyed, I guess, and I pretty much say, we're not playing that, we're not doing that.
Yeah, I thank you both for sharing those thoughts on this, because I think it ties in really well with everything we've been talking about all day, from the very first session, which is, journalism's, present company excluded. These are all reporters working hard to examine things differently, right? But the in general, media attention gets paid when there's a big announcement made. So, the Biden administration committing this money to this issue is not a non-story. It's a big deal, but we need to make sure that everyone follows that money. Like, where does it end up? Does it achieve what it was set out to do? And so I think, Rona and Donzel aren't alone in their concerns. If wherever you are based, talk to people in the community and see what they think is going to happen with that money, right? So anyway, Mayor has a question, so I will turn the floor over to her.
Hi, Rona and Donzel. Rona, I have the opposite problem. Not only am I an environment reporter, but I'm also a person of color in a very white state. And so often the issues that I'm looking at on an environmental level, I'm very eager to build relationships with the tribal nations here, but I'm often looking at a lot of issues that are involving more of the white demographic. So I'm trying to look at things very holistically, and it's a balancing act. But so a question that I have for both of you, we've been talking a lot about the funding that the Biden administration has been giving out, and you both have touched on things you've observed in your community. And Adam, I think, mentioned that, this is something that is so important, and I agree, we all should be following this closely. What are some things you both have learned that perhaps, and you've shared a lot of this already, but what are some things that you've both learned that would probably allow us to examine where this funding is going more closely? And what are some very obvious gaps that you found that perhaps we can also observe and report on more deeply?
So I would say one of the things to take a look at, and each state is different, but they mostly run similar, is what uh, I'll speak for Maryland. What will happen will they will set up potential bond initiatives, and those initiatives come with a set of strings attached. So once a bond initiative passes the state house, it goes to the municipality that has passed for, and then then the organization that requested it has to then submit a request for the bond. So it's like another grant application, right? So the whatever the number comes to Baltimore from the federal government, there'll be a bond and grant process. Currently, that process, and I would encourage you, if you want to really take a deep look at it, look at the restrictions on the money. So right now in Baltimore, for some of that funding, well, I'll use relief funds, COVID relief funds as an example. So right now, the communities need the relief from, the pandemic. Right now, the restrictions on the federal funding are that you would have to be in existence for over 5 years and have over $500,000 budget, and you would have to be able to match the whatever grant is issued or you ask for. You would have to go and find matching funds for it before it was issued, before it's even issued, and then you have 2 years to complete your task, whatever you submit it for. So that's impossible for a community. Like if you're, you know, if you're a community association leader and you need, if you need money for a community association project, or you're a small nonprofit like us, we have not been in operation for 5 years. We don't have a $500,000 budget. And if that organization exists in the community, then they're not working with the community, they're working for academia or larger nonprofits. So, say in your community, you wanted, let's say, 1,000 trees planted in your community, and like, oh, Biden released these federal funds for environmental justice things. I should go ask and get, $5,000, get 1,000 trees planted. But the hurdles you have to jump over to get that money are so complicated and so arduous that you don't do it. And federal funds are use it or lose it. So the only ones who can use it, it's easy for, a large organization to submit large requests for those monies and get them. And they're usually used for the things that small organizations like mine need, is staffing and capacity. They just build their own capacity, but it doesn't really, get to the community. They'll commit to doing a study in a community of like heat mapping, or, they'll study the water quality or something like that. But those are academic institutions, and they're not really sharing that information with the community effectively or making any restorative change. So that's my thought on federal funding.
Thank you so much. No, I really appreciate that. That example helped explain the funding process.
Yeah,
well.
if you want to look at the deeper process, I would say is go back to the original funding bill that has passed through the State House, and that'll give you a great sense of what the process was, because the process is going to determine how the money gets anywhere. And if you do have connections in your state house, make sure you pressure your state legislatures on providing you information on, you want to follow the whole process through committee. So when it was introduced, who introduced it, and what committees it went through, and what amendments were made at what level of the committee and why. Because there's a lot of sausage being made before it gets to the floor for a final vote.
I just want to say, Donzel, you would have been an awesome journalist. I like that thinking. It's really smart. It's
Well,
not
I
too
worked
late.
with the
It's not
best.
too late for you.
Yeah, he was too smart though.
He figured out that he could use his skills to do something more lucrative.
Oh yeah, right. Yeah.
He had his own company before we started this. So not that the nonprofit environmental journalism world is not very lucrative, but we're having a good time nonetheless.
Well, Rona and Donzel, thank you both so much for joining us this afternoon. If anybody wants to shout me down and ask one last question, go for it. Otherwise, we can give our patented IJNR a golf clap round of applause. Thank you both very, very much for closing out our first day. This was a lot of just great stuff to think about, and I've really appreciated the conversation and the work you do, and the time you took to talk to both of us, or all of us. Both of you took to talk to all of us.
I'm gonna put my
Thank you all for the work.
address.
Sorry. I was
Yeah,
just gonna say, thank you all for the work that you do. It's really important.
and Donzel, they're getting your contact info. Don't worry.
Okay, cool.
You haven't heard the last of us. So
Yeah, invite us back. We love to tell people about what we're doing, and we love to hear what other people are doing. And if we can ever be helpful, we're kind of in a hybrid position where we do journalism and writing, and also journalists call us for information about environmental justice. So we're sometimes a source and sometimes originator of information, and and then Donzel does a lot of work, with city officials and developers and community engagement. So we got many missions. I mean, it's all one mission, but we're doing many things. So.
all right. Well, thanks again for all of our participants. We will see you again.